From the world of politics.
I told Senator Schumer we're only going to work together on this if we make it a very transparent and inclusive process. And he has kept that promise for me.
To the world of business.
Where there is competition, which is most of these cases, and China is not playing by the rules, I don't think you want to take away this tool of Section 301 and the ability to put tariffs on China to help to level the playing field.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. President Biden returned from his trip to Asia yesterday to be confronted with yet another mass shooting in the United States, this one in an elementary school down in southern Texas, where 19 children were killed, in addition to 2 adults. For a reaction from the White House now, we turn to our Washington correspondent, and she is Anne-Marie Hordern. So what is the reaction at the White House, Anne-Marie?
Well, David, as you mentioned, this is just another mass shooting the president had to console the nation with. 1 week before last night's speech, he was talking about that shooting that happened in Buffalo, New York. Last night, it was about this elementary school. You can tell the president was incredibly emotional as well as angry and demanding that lawmakers stand up to the gun lobby. Take a listen.
Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen? Where in God's name is our backbone to have the courage to deal with it and stand up to the lobbies? It's time to turn this pain into action.
So a plea there, David, from the president, really pointing the finger at Congress because there's not much Biden can do by himself. He needs the support of lawmakers. But then when you look at what is going on Capitol Hill, there has been legislation in terms of what a majority of Americans would want, which is just a broader in terms of background checks. That passed the House over a year ago in March, but it's been stalled, and it doesn't seem like there's any way it's going to be able to get through a Senate when you have 50-50 split down the middle.
Well, our hearts have to go out to the families of those 19 children who were killed, in addition to 2 adults. But to really talk about the politics just for a moment, Anne-Marie, given the fact that it seems unlikely Congress is going to do anything about it, does it make sense for the president to expend political capital on this, particularly in an election year?
Well, potentially the administration will use this, and the president said it's time to turn this pain and this tragedy into action. It remains to be seen whether or not this is something similar to the Democrats potentially using the potential overturn of Roe v. Wade to their advantage in terms of wanting to get out there and try to galvanize the Democratic base, because we obviously know one of the biggest issues facing voters come this November, and what they're dealing with right now is higher consumer prices. Potentially, could this change the narrative?
Okay, Anne-Marie, thank you so very much for joining us from the White House. That's Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. We're going to stay in Washington now and turn to Senator Bill Hagerty. He's a Republican senator from Tennessee, a member of the Foreign Relations and Banking and Appropriations Committees, and former U.S. Ambassador to Japan. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. I want to turn to Japan and the trip to Asia just in a moment, but I think we really owe it to everyone to spend a moment on what happened in Texas. And my question to you, sir, is there nothing Congress can do? Put aside exactly what it is, whether it's gun regulation or something else entirely. I think many people in the United States of America are saying this is not the country we want to live in, where we have to wake up and find out about mass shootings in public schools.
Well, I agree with you, David, that my heart goes out to the families of those who lost children, those who are injured. I so appreciate the Border Patrol agents that came to the rescue to keep this from being further, being even more damage than it actually was. My heart goes out to them. The nation is mourning right now, as you are and as so many are. At the same time, I hear what Anne-Marie said. I hate to see this become a political weapon, something that's used just like the Dobbs case that probably be used to try to divert America's attention away from the real problems that we've got right now in terms of inflation, what's happening overseas. You've got situations like last weekend in Chicago. Over 28 people shot in Chicago. That's a city with the greatest, huge gun control regulations there, and this is happening in America. I didn't hear President Biden talking about that. As we look at legislative solutions, I think my tendency is not to look at abridging Second Amendment rights for law-abiding Americans to protect themselves. What I'd like to look at is how you harden soft targets like schools. I mean, when I've come to see you, David, in your offices, it's harder to get into your office. than it is to get into some of these schools. We ought to take a hard look at that.
Well, so that goes to the question I'm asking, and I understand people go immediately to gun control. It's something you've said you're against, other people are for. Let's put that to the side for 1 second, because I think for a lot of Americans, in the wake of things like Sandy Hook, and now what we've seen down in Texas, what we saw in Buffalo, I think a lot of Americans are saying, is it that there's simply nothing that can be done, we just have to get used to it? Or is it that we lack the political will to do what needs to be done?
I don't think we have to get used to it. Look, there are mental health problems. If you look at my home state, we've got huge problems. We're closing mental health facilities because we don't have adequate funding. The funding mechanism is broken. It actually advantages urban situations and disadvantages rural ones. We've got a mental health problem that's really ratcheted up significantly through the pandemic. We need to look at that. Again, I'd look at security around schools. There are areas where we need to be focused, but immediately to turn to let's take away or do away with the Second Amendment, I don't think that's a starting point right here.
Senator, as I say, I really want to ask you about Asia because the president just got back from there, and you are the former U.S. ambassador to Japan, so you know a fair amount about it. And I want to start with a discussion with one of your colleagues yesterday, with Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio. We talked to him about it, and what he said, he thought it was doable to get a real agreement, a trade agreement with Japan. Here's part of what he had to say.
I think what's doable is an agreement with Japan. Remember, during the Trump administration, there was phase one of an agreement with Japan to lower some of the barriers in Japan to our exports, including on the agriculture side, which was a breakthrough. I would say we're about 1/3 of the way toward an actual free trade agreement with Japan already because of that phase one.
So, Senator Hagerty, what do you say to that? Is there a deal to be done with Japan that would benefit us as well as Japan?
Absolutely, David. I worked my heart out. I was ambassador when that deal was done. I spent 2 years working on that deal. It was a free trade agreement. It was partially what we wanted to accomplish. As Rob said, it got a lot done on agriculture. It opened up significant agricultural markets to, in Japan to U.S. farmers. But it also had an excellent component on digital trade. I think it's a component that could be a model for the entire region. And again, there are a number of other areas that I've talked with the Japanese about cooperating, whether it be semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, areas where we have solid interest, and I think where we can do a lot more together, particularly if we look at other partners like South Korea that could join us. This will make America, Japan, and our other partners and allies out there much stronger. It will also help us stand up to China.
How does that compare and contrast to the so-called Indo-Pacific economic framework the president is talking about? As I understand, that's not so much a market access agreement as I think something addressing other issues potentially.
It's not a market access agreement, but I've encouraged the president and the team that's working on this to look at trade as well, to look at market access as well, and again, look at the component that we negotiated in terms of digital trade with Japan and make that an element that could be brought across the entire region. I think it would be well received, and I've strongly encouraged the administration to look at market access as another element that we should pursue.
How does this work with respect to China? Because one of the issues for Congress as well as for the president is China and how we figure out our policy with respect to China. Could then, on something like the IPEF, or for that matter, even the Japan agreement that you're talking about, help us with respect to really position ourselves, if I can put it that way, with respect to China?
Yes. Absolutely, it could, David, and we need to look for every opportunity that we can to deepen our economic ties with our allies in that region. As we do that, I think we make it easier to move supply chains out of China. I think it makes it easier for us to have stronger economic ties with our partners. Those ties will indeed help support greater military ties, greater diplomatic ties, and again, show strength in a region that is so important to the rest of the world.
And finally, let's turn to Ukraine, if we could, for a moment. The war in Ukraine continues apace out in the eastern part, on the Donbass. We've now approved substantially more aid to Ukraine. Is there a next step after that? Is there something more that we can or should be doing?
I hope the next step is to get our European allies to stand shoulder to shoulder with us. The commitment that was made by the United States is $40 billion. That's the entire budget of my home state of Tennessee. I'd like to see an exit strategy on this. I'd like to know exactly what the plan is to use those funds to help Ukraine win. We want to see Ukraine win, but we need to do it responsibly. And again, I'd like to see our European allies step up to the same level. We've gone way ahead now in this effort. We need to see Ukraine step up. I'd also like to see us get back into energy production right here at home. That's the best and fastest way to defund Russia's war on Ukraine. Take the global price of energy down. That's what's funding all of this. We have the answer right here at our doorstep, so we need to take a comprehensive strategic view and look at things like lowering energy prices by getting back into the energy business here in America, being in a position to export to our allies again, and also looking for our allies to step up and join us as we help Ukraine win.
And finally, Senator, one of the things that people have remarked upon is the extent of the bipartisan support for supporting Ukraine for very understandable reasons. But we notice that support may be waning a bit. More of your fellow Republicans are starting to express some reservations. Is there a limit to our support for Ukraine, do you think, as a political matter?
Well, I think what we are conveying right now is unlimited support. We need to be physically responsible. We've got a lot of problems here at home. We've got Europeans that are more proximate to this that need to be standing up and walking shoulder to shoulder with us. At this point, they're not. We leapt way ahead of them. We were at parity with them before this $40 billion package came through. And again, as I said, to put it into perspective, that's the size of my state of Tennessee's entire annual budget. So I think that this really is testing a lot of my colleagues. And we'd like to see an action plan, an exit strategy, and I'd like to see something comprehensive again that includes us going back into the energy business and putting us in a far better strategic position that will defund Putin entirely.
Senator, we always appreciate you taking time to be with us. It's really helpful.
Certainly did.
That's Senator Bill Hagerty, Republican of Tennessee. Coming up, Secretary of State Blinken is to give his long-awaited speech on China policy tomorrow. We get a preview from Keith Krach, who served as Undersecretary of State under President Trump. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're going to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. And for that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. In Uvalde, Texas, authorities say all of those killed in an elementary school shooting were in the same fourth grade classroom. 19 children were killed, along with 2 adults. A number of others were wounded. The gunman was shot and killed by a Border Patrol agent who rushed to the scene. President Biden is planning to visit the town, possibly as soon as this weekend. That's according to Reuters. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he bears full responsibility for illegal lockdown parties at Downing Street. A report on the scandal was released today. The Prime Minister told Parliament he was only briefly at the parties in question and he did not know about the bad behavior that happened later. Saudi Aramco's CEO says oil companies need to invest more in production to meet rising demand and to prevent even higher price volatility. Amin Hassan Nasser spoke exclusively to Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
We don't have a lot of spare capacity. Spare capacity is 2% or lower. In a market of 100 million barrels, that is very low. Right now it is going down, and it's quickly as OPEC and OPEC Plus releasing 400,000 every month. So very soon you have a world that 100 million barrels or more with basically no spare capacity.
And in just the last few minutes, Dow Jones said Aramco approached Valvoline about a takeover. Valvoline shares are surging. China will likely miss its economic growth target by a wide margin for the first time ever. Blame is being placed on the COVID-0 policy, which has hammered the economy. Economists' median forecast for Chinese GDP growth this year has dropped to 4.5%. That's a full percentage point below the official target. Experts think the GDP goal will be downplayed while jobs become the priority. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Mark, thank you so much. I want to pick up on Mark's story there about China and the fall off in GDP growth, because we have been waiting for a policy toward China from the Biden administration since it first took office. We were promised it by the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, a couple of weeks ago. Then he got COVID, but now we're supposed to get it tomorrow. So to give us a background to this and what we should expect to hear, what we would want to hear from Mr. Tony Blinken, we turn now to Keith Krach. He's co-founder and chair of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy. Mr. Krach served as Undersecretary of State in the Trump administration and earlier as chair and CEO of DocuSign. So, Keith, always a treat to have you with us. You know this area terribly well from a business point of view as well as from a government point of view. What should our policy be with respect to China right now?
Well, I think what you need to see from Secretary Blinken is being clear as a bell as a CEO, talking about 3 things. The first is unify and rally our allies and partners. The second is leverage the innovation and resources of the private sector. And the third is amplify the moral high ground of the democratic trust principle versus Russia's and China's power principle. And this is exactly the mission of what we announced today in terms of the commission on global tech security.
So it goes specifically to tech because you know it so well. You come out of there. You were a CEO, after all, of DocuSign. So what do we need to do? How can we come to terms, as it were, with China? Do we need to disengage when it comes to tech, or is there a way we can engage but also protect our interests?
Yeah, David, so here's what I'm seeing going on with some of the most respected board members in corporate America, and that's this. They are demanding a China contingency plan from their CEOs, because what they've seen is they've looked at what happened in Russia. It was a surprise. 300 companies pulled out billions and billions. You can check the Bloomberg terminal out of this, and the magnitude for China is over 10x that. And so if there is a China-Taiwan conflict now, that is absolutely devastating for industry and perhaps catastrophic for the high-tech business. So, your fiduciary duty as a board member is to mitigate risk. So to have that China plan, that's one of the things we're doing at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy, is we're developing that checklist for these boards. We're getting a lot of requests. Yeah,
I bet you are. It makes a lot of sense. You raised it, the possible conflict over Taiwan. It's gotten escalated for various reasons, not least of which is President Biden actually going over there and answering a question, suggesting that maybe we would militarily support Taiwan. It wasn't clear exactly what he meant. The Chinese were none too happy. Now they're having military exercises. Give us your assessment of the risk of this and how the United States can really avoid the possibility of China really making a military move on Taiwan.
Well, it's really great that President Biden made it clear that we have Taiwan's back. I certainly know what it's like when I went over to Taiwan and was the highest-ranking State Department official in 41 years. I was greeted with 40 fighters and bombers. So you can see they're up to their old games again, where they combined it with Russia. And that is part of their four-dimensional game of military, economic, and diplomatic and cultural chess. I mean, they're playing the long game. But the crossroads and the main battleground is technology when you look at this integrated aggression of these authoritarian states.
As we look at U.S.-China policy, particularly in light of what's going on in the U.S. economy right now, and particularly inflation that we're so concerned about, where do you come out on those so-called China tariffs, those 301 tariffs that the Trump administration imposed? And now some people are saying, look at it, if you want to get the cost of things down, take those tariffs off.
Well, I think, what I've seen that's really great, and I hand it to the Biden administration, is great continuity of policy with our programs. I just had a great fireside chat a couple weeks ago with Kurt Campbell, President Biden's Asian czar, and I just did one with the Undersecretary of Commerce. So bringing together, as Senator Hagerty just talked about on your show, an alliance. In the old days we call it the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, but that is what is absolutely required, and it's key that you bring in the private sector. And we focus on that trust principle. And that's exactly what we're doing with this commission. So it's not only, defense, but offense, and that as well. And domestically, it's really important that we educate everybody. These are tough times in terms of supply chain issues, in terms of inflation, and all of that. But we've got to keep our eye focused on this authoritarian threat.
Okay, Keith, it's always great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. This is Keith Krach of the Krach Institute of Tech Diplomacy. Still to come, we're going to get to talk with the former World Bank president and former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zoellick about President Biden's best way forward on foreign policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Season continues.
Shares were down 92%. That stock up 20%.
The shares, they've been all over the place.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Netflix is losing customers in 3 out of 4 of its regions.
Disney Plus dodges the streaming slump.
With exclusive expert analysis.
You've got to parse each and every company.
Commodities, a sea of green. No wonder we got inflation on our mind.
To see this outperformance compared to Netflix,
it's surpassing pre-pandemic levels.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We're checking in the markets right now, and I, for one, am breathing a bit of a sigh of relief. We have Kriti Gupta here to explain it to us. This is the least dramatic day I remember in a while.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair way to characterize it because, I mean, we're looking at the S&P 500 for our radio audience. It's almost about flat on the day, and the most it's moved to the upside is about 0.7%, which, say, 3 years ago would have been quite a significant move for the stock market. But just given the context of the volatility that we've seen lately, it surely isn't. But I think one of the main things to keep in mind here is the commentary on Wall Street right now is, has the stock market bottomed? And right now you're not seeing any major conviction in either direction. You're not seeing major buying pressure. You're also not seeing major selling pressure. So this contributes to the idea of what Chris Murphy over at Susquehanna said. I love the way he phrased it, that it was a buyer strike that was essentially fueling perhaps some of the sell-off. This wasn't panic selling. The markets weren't broken in any way. It was just this kind of revaluation, this reset for a lot of portfolios given just 2 years of gains that we've seen. And if you take that into perspective to see this kind of reset maybe bottoming out, it kind of makes sense in that context.
Well, let me ask it the other way around, whether the stock market has bottomed, or the other way to ask it, has inflation peaked? Because we're starting to see some weakness in some of the eco numbers coming in. And I wonder if people are saying, well, maybe the Fed isn't going to have to go quite as fast, quite as hard.
Yeah, and we got those home sales numbers as well yesterday, which were a bit of a doozy, but also put that into perspective, because if you had looked at those numbers, I think it was like a 549,000 increase, say 3 years ago, that would have been an amazing number. So I think when we're kind of comparing this to moves that have been so drastic, similar to the market moves that we're seeing, putting that in that context, perhaps there is this return to normalcy, which, to your point, David, the question of has inflation peaked, I think that's a more apt question as opposed to is recession in the cards, just given a lot of what the market has been doing is pricing in recession odds at a time when the economy at the end of the day is still growing.
So let me pile one more on the dollar. Because I also see people now talking about maybe the dollar has peaked because it had been so strong on a tear.
Yeah.
And now maybe it's starting to flatten out, even come down a bit.
Yeah, and this, I think, folds into the inflation peaked question as well. And this is very crucial. The dollar was bouncing up against levels you saw in March of 2020, where you did see that kind of panic selling, that major haven bid. And then also going back into 2016, 2017, some of that had to do with the Trump election, the trade war that followed, the strength there as well. But I think the story for the dollar is, although it was following those inflation, those interest rate differentials, it's also following the strength of the U.S. economy. And right now, the U.S. economy isn't as strong as it once was. And in that same vein, the dollar, it doesn't necessarily need to be the haven anymore if you start to see these other central banks get propped up and really catch up to the Fed.
All that and FOMC minutes coming out at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Boy, can't wait for more.
Yeah, there is a lot to digest this morning.
Okay, thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for the report on the markets. And you can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, when she's going to be anchoring Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, we're going to speak with the woman in charge of regulating the financial sector in the state of New York, and she is Adrienne Harris. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Now we want to keep you up to date with all the news from around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. In Uvalde, Texas, authorities say all of those killed in an elementary school were in the same fourth-grade classroom. 19 children were killed, along with 2 adults. A number of others were wounded. The gunman was shot and killed by a Border Patrol agent who rushed to the scene. President Biden has demanded action to curb the violence. Gun control legislation is stalled on Capitol Hill. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he bears full responsibility for illegal lockdown parties at Downing Street. A report on the scandal was released today. Speaking in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister reiterated his apology.
I'm humbled by what has happened, and I renew my wholehearted apology for the gathering in the Cabinet room on the 19th of June 2020, my birthday, for which I received a fixed penalty notice.
Prime Minister Johnson told Parliament he was only briefly at the parties in question and that he did not know about the bad behavior that happened later. Russia is getting pushed closer to a default after the U.S. Treasury let a key sanctions waiver expire. American banks and individuals are now barred from accepting bond payments from Russia's government. That indicates the U.S. would rather force Russia into default rather than allow Moscow to spend its dollars to benefit American investors. The Food and Drug Administration says millions more cans of baby formula will be available in the U.S. in the coming months. UK-based and France-based companies are preparing infant food shipments. House lawmakers are holding a hearing today to try to get to the bottom of the shortage. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. The Department of Financial Services provides state regulation of the entire financial sector in the state of New York. Adrienne Harris is the superintendent, and we got to talk to her earlier today. And we started out with her by asking what her priorities are for her department.
The remit of the Department of Financial Services in New York State is incredibly broad. We cover foreign banks, 17 of the 30 GSIBs, thousands of insurance companies, virtual assets, debt collectors, you name it, it really does fall under our purview. So our priorities are many, but really I think about the 3 Ps when I think about our priorities at DFS. The first is policy, and I'm a firm believer that we can protect consumers, protect markets, and make New York a great place to do business. The second is process. I'm a stickler for operational excellence, so making sure we can be efficient and move quickly, stay abreast of innovation in the space, but without sacrificing the regulatory rigor that our department requires. And the third is people. I'm sure the watchers know, the viewers know, it's really a war for talent, and I'm committed to making sure we have the best people at DFS.
New York is a center for financial activity. It has been for a long time. It's important to the economy of New York. How do you balance, on the one hand, regulating businesses and making sure we're attractive for businesses in New York State?
Absolutely. Well, financial services has always been a space that thrived on regulation, having clear rules of the road. Going back to the 1800s when New York had the first banking law, before there was banking law on the national level, and that's why Wall Street is here. And you see the same thing when we think about virtual assets. New York is the first regulator to regulate virtual assets. We're the preeminent prudential regulator right now for virtual assets. And that community is here in New York and thriving.
Great name, virtual assets. I guess that's like digital assets. Yeah. But right now, you're taking a look at those. As you say, you're in the leadership of that. We're waiting in Washington for them to have federal regulation. The president has issued an executive order. They're taking a look at it, thinking about it. How do you proceed the way you need to in New York while you don't know exactly what the feds are going to do?
Yeah, we work very closely with federal regulators, the entire alphabet soup, members on the Hill with the administration, and so they can learn from our experience in the digital asset or virtual asset space. So we have in New York the BIT license, we have a limited purpose trust charter. It's a very robust regime we have for regulating virtual assets, and we've been at it for a long time, and our standards are very, very high, but it continues to attract companies to New York, and having that engagement with Washington is really helpful as they seek to regulate this space because they are learning from us.
One form of digital assets, cryptocurrencies, are changing very dramatically. We've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks that they just plummeted in value. Mm-hmm. What has that done to inform how you approach the regulation of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it really does help us think about not only the value of the regulatory framework that we have, but how we need to think about these things going forward. So for instance, with stablecoins, when they're licensed by DFS, we require one-to-one reserving with cash and cash equivalents for every coin that's on-chain. We require third parties to attest to the reserves of our licensed companies, and we require internal and external audits as well. So we really have quite a rigorous framework here.
So that takes me back in a sense to a prior question, which is other people are not requiring that. Other jurisdictions are not requiring that. How do you make sure that New York doesn't fall behind in sort of the race for cryptocurrency when other jurisdictions, whether in the United States or elsewhere, are not requiring things like reserves on stablecoins?
Yeah, well, to the contrary of what might be the popular belief, we see that clarity, those rules attract companies to New York. So in 2021, 46% of venture capital investment in cryptocurrency was in New York-based and regulated companies. That's more than Silicon Valley. It's more than Miami. So we know that having those clear rules of the road is good for consumers, good for markets, and can be good for companies as well.
Another area that the SEC is working on is disclosure of climate risk. I know that you've already moved forward on insurance. What about banking for New York State?
Yeah, so one of the first things I did when I came into the department was to create a standalone climate division. It's the first of its kind in the nation. And as you noted, we've done work on insurance. We have some banking guidance that's soon to come out. So it'll be some rules of the road for the banks of New York as well.
Soon, like how soon?
Soon, within the next few weeks, I think.
For the next few years. And again, how do you make sure that that's consistent with what the SEC may be requiring? Because a bank may be saying, wait a second, I got conflicting or overlapping responsibilities here.
Yeah, so what we do is we coordinate very closely, not only with the federal regulators, but also with international regulators. Because we regulate so many foreign banks, we want to make sure we're not working at cross purposes. So we don't think so much about disclosure as we think about safety and soundness and the financial risks that come with climate change.
Finally, a subject very much in the news right now is sanctions on various Russian entities, particularly financial entities. Yeah. What are the responsibilities of your organization in making sure that banks are not being used to evade some of the sanctions, whether they're New York banks or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, within hours of the war starting, we issued guidance to our banks to remind them of their requirements around sanctions, Bank Secrecy Act, and anti-money laundering requirements, as well as their cybersecurity requirements. DFS was one of the first regulators to publish cybersecurity regulations. We're actually now in the process of updating those this year. And we've been monitoring and working with our banks closely, not just the New York State chartered banks, but also the 17 GSIBs and the foreign banks that we regulate.
And what's the level of compliance that you're detecting? Are you seeing some people actually trying to evade or being used to evade, even if they're not trying to?
You know, I think the banks are largely very good at this. They've had some experience with this, so we work very closely with them to monitor transactions. We work closely with the Treasury Department, OFAC, FinCEN, and others to monitor transactions and to make sure the assets and their exposure to Russia is minimized and that they're winding it down responsibly.
That was Adrienne Harris. She's New York State Department of Financial Services Superintendent. Coming up here, former World Bank President and U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zoellick. He's going to be here on President Biden's trip to Asia, the war in Ukraine, and the developing Biden foreign policy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. President Biden, of course, has just returned from his trip over to Asia, where he tried to really forge some new alliances over there. At the same time, we have the ongoing war with Ukraine and all of our efforts to try to dissuade Russia from continuing to prosecute that war. So it raises questions for many presidents who come to office hoping it's going to be about domestic politics, and they get dragged into foreign affairs. We have somebody now who really knows about this area. He's Bob Zoellick, principal in the Brunswick Group. He served as ambassador. He was World Bank President and U.S. Trade Representative, the Deputy Trade Secretary of State, and he's author of America in the World. Bob, thanks so much for being with us. So we are focused on foreign affairs right now with Asia and with Ukraine. Give us your sense. You wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying, to some extent, President Biden has almost a fork in the road between becoming either Harry Truman on the one hand, which would be the good alternative, or Jimmy Carter, the bad. What's the difference between those two alternatives?
Well, you know, the interesting part is Truman, Carter, and President Biden all came to office after traumatic presidencies. You know, the death of FDR, Nixon's impeachment, and the Trump years. And so I think all three wanted to try to stabilize the country, but all three faced what are going to turn out to be an interesting set of challenges. All three had some very big inflation, which created some trouble on the economic side. They struggled with the left wing of their party that wanted to pull them further to the flank. But then all three had very big international events that they wouldn't have expected when they took office. And so Truman decided, after losing the Congress in 1946, to really focus on being foreign policy president, made some courageous decisions to really sort of set up what became American international foreign policy for the next 40 years. Carter tried, struggled, and failed. And so I think if we look at President Biden today, you know, it's natural when you're in the White House. I've been there. I was a deputy chief of staff under the first President Bush, is that, you know, you're inundated with things going on. You're dealing with the tactical questions. But the reason I wrote the piece is I think he's going to have to make a switch on this to try to sort of reset his policy for the future.
So let's talk about the two big issues that we always talk about when it comes to foreign policy. China on the one hand and Ukraine, Russia on the other. And specifically on Ukraine, Russia, we had George Soros over at Davos really saying that the Russia-Ukraine thing could be cataclysmic for civilization. This is part of what he had to say.
The invasion may have been the beginning of the Third World War, and our civilization may not survive it.
Bob, that's pretty dramatic talk. You have a lot of experience, State Department, as you say, at the White House, otherwise, at the World Bank. Do you think that that's right? This could be the start of World War III?
It's a very serious issue. And obviously, I hope we could certainly avoid that course. But I guess what I would highlight is that, all during the Cold War, we always are very sensitive when it came time to a potential conflict with another nuclear power. Now, right now, President Biden has avoided U.S. forces in Ukraine. I think that's the proper decision. We're trying to support the Ukrainians in their ability to defend themselves. But depending on the course of the conflict, I think what George Soros and some others would probably at least urge people be attentive to are what are the risks of escalation? What different events could sort of start to lead this, whether chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, other aspects? If you look at President Putin, this goes to the core of his view of Russia's place in the world. He believes Ukraine really isn't an independent state. He's 69 years old. This is his place in Russian history. This is a man who's not going to back down. Now, the Ukrainians, I think, to the surprise of many people and wonderfully have shown great fortitude. They've been supplied. They're fighting back. But I think it's going to be a bloody battleground for a time to come. And so, in a sense, it's going to be important for the U.S. and allies and others to work with Ukraine, but also think about kind of what are our real strategic objectives here.
As the Ukrainians have success, or at least they keep the Russians from having success, does the risk of escalation go up the better the Ukrainians do?
Well, one of the issues I think that the world hasn't paid quite enough attention to, but will increasingly need to, is, the Ukrainian economy is basically hanging on by a thread. And the IMF says it needs about $5 billion a month to sort of keep going. Now, Congress just spent, $40 billion for a variety of sources. But, how many times will Congress or Europe be willing to do that? So that's going to be a big issue. Now, if Ukraine is successful in holding the Russians off, they'll probably want to fight for getting the territory back. And the question is, how much? Will they try to go on to Crimea? Will they try to free some of the area in the east? Those are some of the potential escalation scenarios that probably a Soros or Kissinger are at least cautioning people to think about. But frankly, we're at a stage now where we have to help the Ukrainians be successful in holding off the Russians. The Russians are trying to, frankly, squeeze the Ukrainian forces in the east, some of the better Ukrainian forces, with a pincer movement from the north and the south. And they're trying to move across the Black Sea coast. And you've been reading about the effects of that with agricultural markets, because a lot of the grains come from Russia and Ukraine. A lot of developing countries are going to be hurt by this. So again, I think what part of the point that Soros is raising is there ripple or even potential wave effects on this in energy, food, developing countries. And we're just at the start of this.
Bob, finally, let's come back to your piece for a moment and analogy to Harry Truman. It strikes me there was one big difference between then and now. At the end of World War II, as I read the history books at least, the United States was bestride the world. I mean, it had so much power, economic power, military power, compared to anybody else. That's no longer true. It's been evened out quite a bit, I believe. Does that limit what President Biden can do? For example, in the Pacific, as he wants to put together this Indo-Pacific economic framework, he wants to build up various relationships. Is he more limited than Harry Truman was?
Well, that's a really good point, David. But if you go back, and I know we're talking about the book, you've got to read the Truman chapter yet on 47, 49. The key for U.S. power after World War II and all during the Cold War was the relations with allies and partners. And even if you consider China today with its rise, compare its allies, North Korea, maybe Cambodia, with the range that the U.S. has. And so the strength of the United States then and now is alliance leadership and management. And so to President Biden's credit, I think he wanted to go to Asia for this trip to restore some of the ties, particularly with Japan, South Korea, Australia, that had been frankly wounded during the Trump years. He's trying to build a relationship with India, but India will not be an ally. It has its own sense of strategic autonomy. But one of the other aspects of the trip that I think was disappointing was the United States ran these alliances not just through security, but also through economics, through trade, through the attraction of the U.S. economy, our innovation. And Biden has been very sluggish on that because of domestic politics. He came up with a proposal while he was in Asia that kind of one of my friends said is kind of a tepid tea, and we'll not even be sure if it's going to be served. And so I think one of the challenges for Biden, as for Truman, was combining an economic leadership along with the security leadership.
Okay, Bob, it's great to have you with us. And just to clarify for everybody, that book he's talking about is America and the World. I am working my way through it. I'm in the interwar years. He's right. I'm not quite up to Truman yet, but I'm dying to get there. It's a terrific book. Bob, thank you so much.
We'll come back after you finish that chapter, David.
Okay, that's what we'll do. We'll do a little book club here on the air. That's a good idea, Bob. Okay, that is Ambassador Robert Zoellick. He served as the president of the World Bank as well as the United States Trade Representative. Coming up, we go through yesterday's primaries with Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, we had primaries in 5 states yesterday, and now we want to bring the results of what we found out. And for that, we turn to Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, thanks so much for being with us. The big one we talked about going into it was Georgia. What did we learn, particularly in the Senate side as well as the governor, for that matter?
Well, not a good night for Donald Trump. We've been looking at a lot of these, David, of course, through the prism of the Trump brand, the Trump endorsements. This was the big one, Georgia. A lot of people were watching this as the president, the former president, really leaned into these races as Georgia was, kind of ground zero, if you remember, for the fight to overturn the 2020 election. He endorsed a couple of candidates, high profile, really leaned into these races. One was for governor, the other for Secretary of State. And wow, like I said, hard to put a good shine on this. Governor Brian Kemp won. He beat the Trump-endorsed candidate, the former Senator David Perdue, by 50 points. It's not often that we can say that. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who Trump famously called to ask to find extra votes in Georgia, he still beat Congressman Jody Hice, who actually gave up a House seat to run for this state-level job that he did not end up getting. So 2 big rebukes there for Donald Trump, but he did have one easy win. Football star Herschel Walker was heavily favored to win the Republican Senate primary. He did. He will face Senator Warnock. Also in Georgia, I have to mention Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene, only because she gets so much coverage, David. She did cruise to a win in her primary, avoiding a runoff in that case. In Arkansas, another big state for primary voting that we were watching, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, President Trump's former press secretary, won her primary pretty easily, primary for governor. She's considered political royalty in the state. She'll face Democrat Chris Jones. But royalty did not play well in Texas. George P. Bush, we talked about him, the last remaining member of the Bush family still holding office in Texas, lost in a runoff to a Trump-endorsed incumbent, David, who is being investigated by the FBI, which ought to tell you a lot about the status of the Bush name in Texas. Another one that I'll mention, Henry Cuellar, Texas, in a congressional district adjacent to where the shooting happened yesterday. The last pro-life Democrat in the U.S. House managed to win, avoid a runoff and win in his runoff, I should say, even after the leak of the Supreme Court draft on Roe v. Wade. There were a lot of questions about whether that Roe story was going to impact the outcome in this race. Right. Congressman Henry Cuellar lives to see another day.
So, Joe, taking all that's a wonderful wrap-up. Thank you so much. Taking it all together, and it may be premature to draw inferences, but I wonder if we're starting to see a separation between Trump the man and Trump the policies. Because if you go back, for example, a governor of Georgia, the policies of the government are pretty much down Trump lines. It's the person maybe people are starting to distance from the policies.
That's true. Remembering as well that Mike Pence himself got involved in this race. He actually showed up in Georgia to stump in person, to campaign in person for Brian Kemp, creating a real split here between Trump Nation and the establishment Republican Party. It's going to be interesting to see if candidates exploit that fissure in the next couple of primaries.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much for that. As we just said, somebody said epic wrap-up. Really appreciate it. That's Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 o'clock on Bloomberg Radio. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, we're going to have a second hour Balance of Power on radio. We're going to talk to the NAACP president. He is Derek Johnson.